This RealAg Radio podcast is brought to you by new Focus NXT herbicide from FMC. Focus NXT herbicide delivers a complete burn-off and extended residual control solution tailored for spring wheat growers in the black soil zone. See your local retailer today.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday edition of the show. Thanks so much, everybody, for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your workday. Also, of course, a huge shout out to everybody listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast. And today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. Advancing fertilizer technology for sustainable growth. RhizoSorb is a patented technology that is designed to maximize phosphorus efficiency and improve the economics of fertilizer for manufacturers, retailers, and growers. You can find out more by going to Phospholutions.com. And we're going to hear from Craig Dick of Phospholutions here today on the show in a product spotlight with Lyndsey Smith. They are making major advances in this area. This is a very cool technology, everybody, that I'm hearing a lot of positive stuff from some of the retailers and agronomists that have been working with the product in both Canada and the U.S. So again, the product is RhizoSorb, and today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. You're going to hear some stuff today about Phospholutions I think is very, very exciting, and encourage you to check it out. Phospholutions.com. Today, we're going to hear an interview that I did with Ted Bilyea. And when we think about the challenges, when we think about the opportunities, and trying to connect all that with a strategy and actually take action, I can't think of anyone better to chat with than Ted Bilyea. He is one of the sharpest minds that we have from just in this country when it comes to agriculture, agri-food, and connecting that as well with what's happening around the world and trying to serve markets as we try to spur economic growth. We try to take advantage of those opportunities we talk about all the time at all the meetings across the country and really seize the day on it. And so Ted was a guest of mine on the Final Mile podcast, which is brought to you by RDAR. Now, Ted, if you don't know Ted, he's a distinguished fellow with CAPI. He's a board member at RDAR. He also is a former executive vice president with Maple Leaf Foods. He was at Maple Leaf for like 35 years. Okay, he's got some great stories, and he's got some great insights, and we're going to hear them here today on the program. So looking forward to the conversation with Ted Bilyea. If you have any feedback, commentary, thoughts, and stuff you hear from Ted or any other issue that's happening in the world of agriculture, you can always send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or you can call or text the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Let's get to my conversation with Ted Bilyea.
You know, we have so many things affecting agriculture today that from different angles, you know, that people have referred to it as the Polycene. I don't know if you've heard that name, before, but that's essentially when you get all kinds of different things happening at the same time: technological change, environmental change, disease issues, and geopolitical rapid transformations of all kinds of things that turn into crises, that essentially polycrises. And I would put us kind of in that. But having said that, I look at Canada as rather a unique, special case. So a good example of that, if we talk about how things change overnight first, last week this time, we had a significant competitive advantage on pork going into China. We had a duty of 25%. The Europeans on their frozen pork going there, their duties ranged anywhere from 15 to 60% because the Chinese had a temporary, duty on it while they were sorting out what they were going to do with the Europeans. All of a sudden, late last week, that changed, and the Europeans now have an advantage. Their duties run from about 6% to maximum 20, and ours is 25. So we flipped inside of 2 days from very competitive to less than competitive. Hard to run a business on that basis. But if we back up a bit further and say, okay, so why overall am I optimistic on Canada? That basically is because I think in a sense we're going to be the last man standing, and I'll give you an example of that. So this year we're into what the International Grains Council looks at as perhaps one of the largest crops in history. 2.4 billion tons of grain, maybe. And everybody's getting rattled about that, and because Canada is part of that, we've had a great grain crop, mostly in Western Canada, not less so in the East. But the reality of that is that if you look back at the last 5 years, using the same numbers, we've increased the global production of grain every year. But we've increased consumption just a little more than production every year. And why haven't we noticed that? Because we've taken it out of the stocks. So if you look at the stocks for the last 5 years, they actually declined slightly, and that's how we made the difference up. That's telling you something long term. And if you add into that what the USDA has been saying, what the FAO and OECD and easiest read is the GAP report that Virginia Tech puts out. Recommend that to your listeners to have a look at that. It tells you that productivity is not keeping up. Is not high enough to be able to keep that demand and supply in check. Productivity is actually falling, and particularly in the developed world, with our world, and to some degree that's because our research budgets have not kept up with demand, or we haven't focused on the right things, one or the other. But having said that, the strange part about it is that despite the fact that we are not fully keeping up with demand in the productivity sense, we are seeing very strange pricing. If you look back at the last 50 years, our levels of where we are today in the globally on grain, for example, or all foods. If you look at the FAO food index, which is produced every month, I'm sure your readers and listeners look at that. We're hovering around the same high levels that we did in the mid 70s when we had the great grain robbery, and come in, and followed by the oil crisis. So we're at those two high points, and yet we're not, consumers are feeling that they're feeling the pinch, but farmers are feeling that there's something wrong, that the pricing isn't right. So it's very, very odd situation. You say, well, how do we get into that kind of a mess? And then you begin to look at, what's been happening with trade. And you're getting trade moving all over the world into very strange places. It's a very inefficient trade flows today.
Yeah.
Largely because of these geopolitical messes that we just talked about in the beginning. And so it's a very screwed up world. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to where are we going to be, in 10 or 20 years from now, with a continual population increase, at least for the next 20 years. Everybody's panicked about, oh my God, we're going to lose all these people, at some point, birth rates are going to fall. That's not happening anytime soon. But more importantly, even at the low growth rates we have today, Shaun, we're beginning to consume a lot more, particularly protein and fats, than we can produce. So I think the chances of us making the 41 million tons that we need of protein in the next 10 years, that, you can see that in the FAO stuff, that's as meat protein, that's very unlikely. And I'm sure your listeners know full well why. So
today on RealAg Radio, we're playing a conversation that I had with Ted Bilyea. It was episode 1 of the Final Mile podcast, which is brought to you by RDAR. And you can find the episode at RealAgriculture.com or on the Real Agriculture YouTube channel. Of course, today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. We'll be back with more of my conversation with Ted right after this.
Although the cost per ton is higher, Rhizazorb is cheaper per acre than MAP. Rhizazorb is more efficient, therefore we use less fertilizers two deliver the same amount of phosphorus to the crop. On average, growers save $5 to $7 per acre, and RiseAbsorb has a demonstrated yield increase of 3 to 5 bushels, generating a $20 ROI compared to MAP. You can go to Phospholutions.com and check out our grower savings calculator and see how much you can save on your farm.
It's now time for a product spotlight. Chad Yanchinski, the sales manager with FP Genetics.
A couple of varieties I wanted to touch on quick. Across AAC Hockley, big wheat variety that we've had here across Western Canada the last several years. Stands really, really well. Got a nice protein on it, really nice field package on it. Phenomenal disease package on it. Goes through the combine really, really nice. And good sprouting tolerance on it as well. The next variety is SY Manus. A little bit more of a regional fit varieties. We see big acres of it here in Manitoba. And then when you get into southern Alberta, into some of that irrigation country. It's a variety that really likes water. So short in stature, stands really, really well, and puts out the bushels, so it's got a really, really high yield potential to it.
Now, the other thing, you've got some additional resources from a staff perspective to serve some of the market.
Eastern and Western product specialists. With these new positions, really what they're focused on is bringing kind of that next level support to independent agronomists, to farmers themselves, and to the retail locations as well that are selling seed. So that's part of their job, is to really educate people on how X variety fits in this zone. Go to the fpgenetics.ca website.
Today on RealAg Radio, we're planning for you a conversation with Ted Bilyea, Distinguished Fellow with CAPI, as well as a board member with RDAR, longtime Maple Leaf Foods executive, retired, but still doing a ton of stuff and contributing to the great industry of agriculture. And today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. Make sure you go to Phospholutions.com and check out how their proven technology is really changed the game when it comes to phosphorus efficiency. Let's continue the conversation with Ted Bilyea.
What's led us to the productivity issue? How do we get out of it?
Well, I'm not 100% sure we will. That's
Okay.
the first thing.
And just so I understand this, Ted, this is not just a Canada issue. This is this productivity issue is
It's global.
Yeah, it's a global.
In Canada, the developed world, Shaun, as you know, it makes sense that we've layered in a lot of productivity over the last 50 years. You know, that's for sure, and it's come through a lot of great research, you know, and genetic changes to plants and animals. All great stuff, but it has to keep growing at a pretty high rate. Your productivity has to increase about 2% a year, and it's not anywhere near that right now.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, the developed world their productivity is increasing faster, but when you look at it, it's still not fast enough. And where their productivity is increasing the fastest is not necessarily through great research. It's through bringing more land into production and essentially depleting their groundwater resources.
Well, you look at the increase in the arable acres in like a place like Brazil. You know, they continue to just find more farmland.
Huge, like 70 million acres appearing almost overnight. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, but there's a limit to that. That's productivity that has a physical limit at some point. And as you bring that, particularly if you're bringing rainforests into production, which is happening in Brazil and Africa, there are consequences of that. And the consequences of that are you're changing. There's a reason we call a rainforest a rainforest. If it rains a lot, it creates its own rain. Once you take the forest away, then you begin to have problems that they had 2 years ago in Brazil where you had a drought in the northern part. And, you know, that can upset things mightily very quickly.
Now, for some of the audience, they may be listening to this and being like, okay, whoa, wait a minute here. Seems like we're highly productive in the grain sector. We've got an abundance because of where yields have been. We have an abundance of product right now, and prices are depressed. What are you talking about, Ted? What do you mean we're not as productive as we should be?
Well, let's go back to again. Prices are depressed, but I think the bigger problem that prices are depressed from the peak that we had after the invasion of Ukraine and after COVID. But as I said to you, they're far from depressed if you look at this on a long-term basis. They're higher than they were. What is a problem is that the input costs are very, very high, and they have been going up. So what farmer can earn out of this is a crisis, and not one we should take lightly. But what I'm trying to lay for you is there is a foundation why, in a sense, many countries are beginning to look at Canada. If you're like, most of the world are net importers of food, okay?
Right.
It's really important to understand that you name the crop or the animal, and I can tell you how many players it takes to be the control over 70% of the net exports of that product. So if you take virtually any of the grains, less than 7 countries control more than 70% of the net exports globally. And Canada features in virtually all the categories that we produce, whether it's canola or wheat or or pork, or you can name quite a few, pulses for sure. In some cases, less than 7 to produce 80% of the net exports. Well, that means most of the world are net importers of food, and the ones that are big net importers, like Japan and Korea, for example, are beginning to realize that, hey, maybe we should be working something out with people where our food security is at stake, because this is a very unsettling world that we live in. So suddenly that becomes the base case for agriculture in Canada. But that's not where you stop, and you need to add on to that. What kind of research are you going to do? What kind of things are you going to do that separate you from everybody else, so that when you get big crops, it doesn't destroy you? Yeah. And the answer to that is differentiation in a huge way. You shift that productivity from, I want to be the most efficient producer and the cheapest guy on the block, which we'll never be, to I want to be the supplier of something to a consumer or a customer that they can't get anywhere else. And we have a pretty good history of that. And much of that it could have come through research, but much of that has come more by accident almost. And the pork industry exists today in Canada as a substantial industry because in 2 different occasions we did things that were, I would say, initially hated and turned out to be absolutely perfect. And the first one was the introduction of back at the time before the Civil War, when a chap came over from England, and William Davies, and introduced the British breeds into the Canadian hogs, because in those days all the hogs were lard hogs that the Americans produced, and you needed lard. And timing was perfect, because after the Civil War we got big duties on everything. Barley was going into the United States with free, and suddenly it had a duty on it, and with tariffs. And as those tariffs got bigger, lo and behold, we found an export market for our pork in the UK and in Europe in general. And that was a huge market for us, and it built packing houses across the country simply because we were different. And then we repeated the same thing again when essentially Canada Packers and my team invented chilled pork. Mm-hmm. And the day we did that, and we did it in an American plant, because I couldn't do it in our own plants. That was people were adamant about the fact that you're crazy. Why are you doing that? You're spending money for needlessly. Frozen is just as good as chilled any day.
So it was either fresh or frozen at that time.
Yeah, there was no chill. But it happened because I was in a Hormel plant. They were sending fresh pork to New York City because they were getting huge complaints in the middle of that. It was a very hot summer in the 80s, and they couldn't handle the complaints, so they started cutting loins in half because they had nothing to put them in, putting them in a cryovac bag that fit it, and putting it in ice. And I was in the plant because we were exporting Hormel's frozen product to Japan along with our own. And I asked them, I said, why are you destroying all the value in this loin? He said, It's the smelly pork claims. And I said, what's it doing? It's giving us another week of shelf life. We have one, now we get 2 weeks of shelf life. I spent the rest of that summer with my Japanese technician in that plant, trying to see if we could get it to 3 weeks. Because if we could add one more week, we could take it to Japan. And the only country in the world that was exporting to Japan chilled pork was Taiwan. The only one. And lo and behold, by that fall, we had our first shipments. And Shaun, that's where we moved from what was the red ocean, into the, not just the blue ocean. We went right through it. We were in the white space. There was no competitors. And we had at least 2 years of that. And then unfortunately, that old Hormel plant shut down. And, had it not been for Alberta in the Gainers, situation where Gainers went bankrupt and the Alberta government took it over and a discussion with their deputy minister at the time, I said, he was saying, we got this plant losing tons of money on our hands. I don't know what to do with it. I said, how would you like to build the first chilled pork line? And he said, what's it going to cost? And so I gave him I said, we'll supply all the technology for it. And, our trading division. And, sure enough, within 6 months, that plant was starting to make money. And that was the first chilled pork exported. It really never worked well, because I could never convince our own people at the time, because our main shareholder was a Brit at the time. But when Wallace McCain came along, it took him all of about 5 minutes to understand what I was talking about. And he said, I'll build you a plant. That was the start of Brandon. And then I converted the one in Lethbridge, the beef plant in Lethbridge, to a Japanese plant. That's about differentiation, eh? And then you had to go on and preserve it, because the technology eventually spread. The rest, other Canadians got it, and Americans and climbed into the technology, of how you get chilled, because we was pretty good. So then we had to continue to layer in many other things to keep the differentiation. And that's why you've got chilled pork. Canadian chilled pork is kind of the global standard. It's the best. And, we just won the Golden Apple Award in Shanghai Food Fair, which is huge, and that's based on, having a consumer trust and, essentially brand recognition because I said consumer, customer trust and brand recognition. Yeah. I think our next step is to see if we can move that to consumer.
You're listening to my conversation with Ted Bilyea, senior fellow with CAPI, as well as board member at RDAR and longtime Maple Leaf Foods executive. And today's show was brought to you by Phospholutions. Go to Phospholutions.com. Speaking of Phospholutions, when we come back, we're going to hear a product spotlight with Craig Dick of Phospholutions. You're not going to want to miss that. We'll be back with more of my conversation with Ted Bilyea. Lots to talk about here today on RealAg Radio.
Questions about the markets? Sanoa by GrainFox is your AI grain market analyst, ready 24/7 to help you make smarter grain marketing decisions. Ask about market trends, pricing signals, basis, or what today's moves mean for you, and get clear, instant answers. Get a free trial and special savings at grainfox.ca/realag. grainfox.ca/realag. Ask Sanoa. Get an answer. Take action. It's that easy. Get started now.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. It's now time for a product spotlight with Koch Agronomic Services, and we're joined by Bryce Geisel.
So it really is going to depend on the source of your nitrogen, where you're applying it, how you're applying it, when you're applying it. All those pieces are going to have a huge influence, and there really is no one-size-fits-all. So if we look at the stabilizers, you can utilize a urease inhibitor like Anvil, and that's going to help reduce that volatilization losses of urea or UAN. You can use a nitrification inhibitor like Centurion. That can be used whether it's anhydrous ammonia, UAN. That help reduce that leaching denitrification loss. So those two pieces. And then there is the dual inhibitors and used to be able to help manage all three forms of loss. So a product like Super U or Tribune. Have a good understanding of what your loss conditions are going to be based on your operation, and then choose the product that's going to help that.
If somebody wants more information, where do they go, Bryce?
Absolutely. You can go to Koch, that's KOCH, agronomicservices.ca.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am Lyndsey Smith. It's time for today's Product Spotlight with Craig Dick with Phospholutions. Craig, how are you doing?
Doing great, Lyndsey.
All right. Now, we're going to talk today about Rhizosorb. What is it, and why should farmers be using it in the place of traditional MAP or DAP fertilizer?
Yeah, Rhizosorb is our patented phosphate efficiency technology that's built into the fertilizer granule. So it's essentially a next generation MAP DAP fertilizer replacement for your MAP DAP. We're twice as efficient at feeding the plant. Therefore, we can apply less product on a per acre basis, provide that grower an upfront cost savings of around 10% per acre, and then give the same or maybe slightly better yield. And so the average ROI for most growers is in that $20 an acre range, and sometimes we see it a little bit higher on some Canadian small grains.
Now, what is Rhizosorb? Is it a biological, or is this something else?
Yeah, Rhizosorb is a metal oxide technology. It was developed in the horticulture department at Penn State University. Our founder and CEO, Hunter Swisher, licensed that technology, and our science team has developed that technology into a ready-to-use fertilizer product. And it works really across all soils types, pH ranges. We've done trials in 19 countries, hundreds of trials in the U.S. and Canada.
So, and that's maybe the key point here. Whenever it comes to, a new product or something to try, what testing has Phospholutions done with Rhizosorb to make sure that it works in all those different countries that you mentioned and different crops and soil types?
Yeah, so we have a pretty robust small plot replicated trial, which is hundreds of trials. We also have a very large scale field trial program on corn and soybeans. We've mainly focused that in the U.S. Last year we started wheat trials, and we have very good data on wheat now. And then we have some on-farm trials in canola, peas, lentils, durum. And again, what we see is the technology works as promised across varying soils types, crops, regions, conditions. So from Brazil to India to Africa to even Canada, we see the performance of the product.
Now, is this something I add, or is this something that when I order that fertilizer, it comes with it? Walk me through the process.
Rhizosorb is a simple change of asking your retailer for Rhizosorb instead of MAP. That will come with a 10% per acre savings. The growers will also then apply slightly less fertilizer than they're used to. So typically with Rhizosorb compared to MAP, you're going to use about a third less overall volume, which for our growers at Seed Row Place, there's huge advantages in being able to plant more per day with less fills. Additionally, it's got a lower salt index. So as you're putting that fertilizer down the seed row, it's much more seed safe.
All right. So saving some time at that critical period, of course, in that seeding season, lower salt index. So we've got that increased seed safety, which is fantastic. So these things are things that I think most growers would be able to hit on and saying, like, this is a huge advantage. And that's before we even really talk about, the ROI and that savings as well. This is the 4th year on the market for Rhizosorb. What has that response been from growers? What do farmers say about using this product?
Yeah, as of last year, we neared over 1 million acres in U.S. and Canada of applied product. And what we find is growers really understand that traditional phosphate like MAP and DAP are inefficient, and they're very expensive. And this week I'm down in Orlando at TFI, getting caught up on all global fertilizer stuff. Unfortunately, with world macroeconomics, that price, we don't expect it to go down in the near future. And so farmers should be trying to find a way to lower their phosphate costs without sacrificing yield, and we believe Rhizosorb helps them do that. And that's what we hear from growers, that they like the cost savings, they like the yield advantage, and they like that it's a simple change. They really don't have to change anything on their farm other than choose a better quality product.
Okay. And great point, on that cost perspective. Tell me a bit more about that as far as looking forward. I know that the cost of phosphorus this year is really top of mind for growers.
Yeah, it's top of mind. It's been high for a long time. And, globally, China doesn't expect to come back into the marketplace India is able to, their government subsidizes phosphate purchases, which is keeping the global price high. And then just, domestically here in the U.S., we have limited producers. And so all that adds up to a lot more phosphorus going into batteries and all this new technology and less coming the way of the farmer. And unfortunately, it puts them in a really tough situation where phosphates for many growers are just out of reach.
All right. So for those who want to talk to their retailer, of course, about RizoSorb, that's the call they make. But what about those that are just looking for more information? Where can they go to learn more about RizoSorb?
Yeah, they can come to our website, Phospholutions.com. On there, we have our performance report where they can see all the data I mentioned earlier. We also have a savings calculator where those growers can go in and put in their acres, their normal application rates, and their local phosphate price and see just how much money they can save on their farm by switching to RizoSorb. And then, of course, we can certainly connect them to the retailers and distribution network that we have available in Canada.
All right. We do love a good calculator. All right. Craig Dick with Phospholutions. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lyndsey.
All right. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio with Syngenta Canada. Go to syngenta.ca to find out more about their great lineup of products. We got Brad Garlow, he's territory sales rep with Syngenta. In season, I know there is a product Syngenta's pretty excited about when it comes to new corn herbicide.
2026, we're going to launch Storn. A simple way of explaining it is pyroxasulfone added to Acuron. We're really trying to help growers that have a water hemp issue and a bluegrass issue. It's a great product, pre-emerge, early post on corn. You can add glyphosate to it if you go early post and kind of do a nice job. Acuron's been working really well for us the last few years, of course, and we're just trying to upgrade that for growers that are seeing this water hemp and bluegrass issue.
Brad, what is the biggest troublesome weed that your customers have to tackle?
I'd say in my territory, bluegrass is definitely an up-and-coming weed. It's becoming more of an issue for most of my growers. The other one, Shaun, is sow thistle. A lot of my territory has IPs and some edibles, and unfortunately in IP beans and edible beans, sow thistle's a tough one to control, so we really have to do a nice job in corn and wheat and really attack that weed when we can.
Big thanks to Syngenta Canada. Today on RealAg Radio, we're planning for you a conversation with Ted Bilyea, Distinguished Fellow with CAPI, as well as a board member with RDAR, longtime Maple Leaf Foods executive, retired, but still doing a ton of stuff and contributing to the great industry of agriculture. And today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. Make sure you go to Phospholutions.com and check out how their proven technology is really changed the game when it comes to phosphorus efficiency. Let's continue the conversation with Ted Bilyea.
Look at it a little higher level across most commodities that we are producing. Are we far too addicted and just comfortable with commoditized sort of selling? We are. Yep. But we talk about value added all the time, but at the end of the day, it just seems like selling commodities is way more comfortable.
It unfortunately is, but more and more of our commodity selling is moving into foreign hands.
Right.
Particularly our grain business. I think the majority, over half the grain business is now handled by non-Canadians out of Canada. I mean, if you think about it, the big changes. Those differentiation things, though, are not unique to pork, and we just need to keep going with them. And look at the potato business in Alberta. That's a business that RDAR has worked very hard at, particularly around the irrigation side. You've got, that's a business that the first export of French fries out of Alberta, it was York Farms in Lethbridge. Then I used to send that stuff to Japan. All of a sudden people started saying, well, these are good French fries. So Shaun, why were the French fries noticeably different in Japan by the Japanese customers than French fries coming from other places in the world? Mm. It was because we controlled the moisture perfectly. And so because you were on irrigated land, and all the other conditions were wonderful too, and we had very low disease. So that became another example of the same thing. And, we shipped bagels to the UK when we took over Canada Bread, started shipping bagels to the UK from our Calgary plant, and we totally changed the entire UK business within a year, because that was retarded dough, Montreal bagel, and what the Brits were eating in their supermarkets was essentially bread with a hole in it.
Right.
And so
not the same.
Every time you do that, you begin to pull money out of, essentially you change the transaction, and it's no longer commoditization. I mean, I have a butcher store in my neighborhood, right near here. Well, guess what? You can walk in that store and buy in Canadian ribeyes, for $59 a pound, and with all kinds of special, trace and everything to Ontario farms. But you can buy Wagyu imported from Australia for over $100 a pound, or you can buy Wagyu from Japan for almost $199 a pound. If people don't believe me, Shaun, tell them to look up the Cumbria Meats website. They'll stun them. They'll be stunned. And then they'll understand why RDAR is thinking about, well, could we do things to beef the way we've done it to pork, and change and much is going on there already, but could we begin to look at the actual product, not just, I want to produce more pounds quickly, but could I produce something that has real consumer benefit? And if you hit that, you're in a different world.
Yeah. It's a lot of times like maybe this is, maybe it's self-reflection, but the food technology space is something that, we see like a press release company rolls out and says, hey, like, your chilled pork example, and the time you're like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. But you don't really necessarily put full thought into what the person that had the idea, like what got to that point. And a lot of times we talk about the successes. We don't necessarily, there's a lot of failures that come with.
Absolutely. I had my share of those. I tried chilled beef before there was such a thing as chilled beef from Lethbridge. Those were the days we didn't have any packaging for it. This was in the 70s, okay?
Yeah.
So the only way I knew you would move beef anywhere was on rails. You could rail it into a rail car and move beef from the Western Canada to Eastern Canada in a rail car, and you railed it back out into a packing house, all on hooks and rails. So what did I do? I put rails in a Sealand container, because I didn't know it, and shut the door and turned the chiller on and sent it to Japan. Well, guess what? The beef arrived and you could eat it. It was well aged. You could eat it, but you couldn't make any money because you couldn't get enough carcasses in the Sealand container to pay for itself. 10 years later, we invented chilled. We didn't invent it. It came to the Australians were the first into it. Chilled movement of chilled beef. About the same time as I was working on the chilled pork, and so they don't all work, But the problem is we don't work hard enough at it, I think. And you know the story of our wheat. I mean, we get the highest priced wheat in the world. Why? Because actually, the rest of the world uses our wheat to blend. They can't make bread in many of the places of the world if they don't blend Canadian wheat in, because they don't get the falling numbers too low.
Right.
So, we need to focus a lot, I think, on two things that would really help. One is make food the old Hippocrates thing. Food is your medicine. So you want to stay healthy, you eat good food. Canada does really well in that area for sure. And I think the other part of it is you want to have something that not only supports health, but is sustainable over the long run for all those net importers who are becoming more nervous about their supply. And one of the things I think that makes them nervous is we're in an era here now. How long it lasts, I don't think anybody really knows, but we're in an era where what we defined as post-World War II rules-based trade kind of being crumpled up and thrown out the window, and it's countries are trying to figure out where they fit in the landscape here. Canada being one of them. Yeah. So Shaun, I think that's another key point. I didn't know if I'd have time to make, but we are moving from free trade situation where we did extremely well to more a mixture of free and mercantilism.
Right.
In the same sense. And watching United States copy China's trade strategy day by day really should send a big message to us. And if we go down that road, Shaun, there's one very controversial thing that I suggest, but people have to be careful with how they use it. But we want to continue to attract foreign capital into the ag business in Canada, but we need to somehow do it in such a way that Canadian ownership remains very key to this puzzle. And we need to today the strange thing is we only have two companies that I think at best, and I'm being generous with the second one. But two companies in Canada, Canadian companies that are actual global food giants. One would be McCain's.
Yep.
Operating in, at least plants in many, many countries. And the other one potentially is Saputo. But the good news about that is that just because they become a multinational and operate in many other countries, they continue to invest heavily in Canada. And you can see that particularly in what's going on in Western Canada, with those French fry plants. But having said that, the next thing we have to do is say, well, you look at the next layer. We have got about 25 to 30, I don't know the exact number because I've never sat down and looked at it, companies that are what I would call national to continental size. Heading up that list would be people like Maple Leaf Foods, Premium Brands, Richardson's,
like Oppenheimer, like Oppie in the produce sector.
Yeah, you can make a fairly decent list of ones that they basically operate in Canada and the United States and Mexico, and to a large degree, but they don't tend to have plants offshore. And what we need to do is have a strategy to take these continental players and graduate them to the likes of McCain and Saputo. And doing so, you get two huge wins out of that. You keep your brain trust for food in Canada. You don't become controlled by essentially foreign multinationals, which is certainly the case in beef. Certainly the case is growing rapidly in grains, and you can begin to become. It's like a security to all the farms that supply these things. Your best, as you know, I've said this many times to many people, and they throw things at me, but your best BRM is having a plant in your backyard that is competitive because it's different. Mm. And that's your best, possible protection. And you only get that in reality if we can take some of these many companies. There's quite a long list actually when you put it together. Particularly, strangely enough, particularly in the bakery side, there's been a growing list of Canadian companies, and because you've seen our bakery business become actually a big piece of the trade surplus that we have with the United States and in the consumer products. So we need to graduate those companies and do it in such a way that we're not saying we don't like SMEs because we're full of SMEs, but a lot of the research programs need to be looking at how do these mid-scale companies or larger continental grade companies, how can they produce something that is really needed by the market? They're not competing on price.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to finish up the conversation with Ted Bilyea from a recent episode of the Final Mile podcast brought to you by RDAR. And today's show is brought to you by Phospholutions. Make sure you go to Phospholutions.com.
And they're off. It's volunteer canola on the inside, followed by hemp nettle, flaxweed, buckwheat, and narrow-leaved hawksbeard. This is one tough field, folks. But hold the phone here, because here comes Prospect Herbicide making a move on the outside and eliminating the competition one by one. And now, way out in front, it's canola for the win. With two powerful modes of action, glyphosate-friendly Prospect provides exceptional control of broadleaf and grassy weeds to get your canola off to the best start possible. Ask for it at your local retailer.
Co-op has been beside local farmers and ranchers for generations. With Western Canada's largest fuel network and a team of local agronomy experts, Co-op is built to keep your operation moving forward. With deep local knowledge of the factors affecting your farm, we're ready to provide trusted advice in the field and on the ground. Count on Co-op to support your entire operation from season to season. Co-op, here for your farm, here for your family. Visit your Co-op Agro Center to talk to a team member today.
RhizoSorb is a patented technology designed to maximize phosphorus efficiency and improve the economics of fertilizer for manufacturers, retailers, and growers. Find out more by going to Phospholutions.com because they're advancing fertilizer technology for sustainable growth, making a lot of inroads and shaking the tree a little bit here in terms of how we look at phosphorus efficiency. Okay, let's get back to my conversation with Ted Bilyea from the Final Mile podcast.
The reverse, if that doesn't happen, is you get, Canadian subsidiaries of those larger foreign entities, and the Canadian president is a commercial manager. A lot of the decisions are not being made in country. They're a liaison to the country, right?
I've seen that in my lifetime, Sean, in a big way.
And what's the case? So, and then some would say okay, that's just the reality of globalization and consolidation in a sector that requires a ton of capital. There could be profits in, say, the meatpacking industry, but the reality is it takes a lot of capital and to enable to do that. So it's not set up for locals to just kind of make it happen. So what's the consequences, Ted?
I've heard that before, but so the opposite to that is that if you go to Canada Pension Fund and you ask them why you're not investing more in Canadian multinationals, and they're saying, well, I'm sorry, but we don't invest 50 million. We invest, I think our minimum, and I don't want to take this out of context, so I'm just going to say, I'll guess, our minimum is a $500 million. Right. Well, suddenly, then what can you put the money into? The money's there, the entities are not. And so you need size matters. So that would be the first piece of that puzzle. And, I think then the second piece of it is that, once you get something that people really want, the biggest problem in Canada I've incurred is you can't scale fast enough.
Right. There's a gap from idea to whatever, large entity. There's a gap.
Once they like it, once the consumer really wants it. Actually, that was one of my biggest headaches. In the pork game, we didn't have enough pork. When we landed the second largest supermarket in Japan, and the president said to me overnight one day, he said, "Hey, I really like the fact that we got your brand in our store, and we were the only branded pork. Everything else was U.S. pork, Danish pork, Irish pork, etc., Canadian pork. We were Maple Leaf pork in the second largest supermarket." And he said, we're going to give you all of Japan, not just Tokyo. That was a nightmare for me, because that would have meant I'd have to take all the Canadian pork that we were, that was about equivalent to Toronto. It's just, okay, well, we just won't ship pork to Toronto. I mean, so that's how difficult it becomes. You have to have some kind of a plan to scale.
Okay, so why do we have a scale problem? So you got to have a plan, but it feels like there's more missing here when we talk about this, because this comes up in a lot of different threads in agriculture and beyond it when we talk about the country.
I really think it gets down to, can you believe the market will still be there tomorrow morning to scale? Because you're not going to scale for Canada.
Right.
I mean, 41 million people. Hell, that's not as big as the Bay Area.
It gets nobody's attention. Mexico City's 27 million or whatever.
Yeah. Well, the only reason we're even on the global map is because, it's not because we're a humongous producer of agriculture. That's nuts. We're not. We don't even, you can hardly see us in total. But it's because we don't eat it. So what we produce is all surplus.
Which is where that lack of rules-based trade, that connects to this, because that's it's a retarder for growth.
It's a huge issue. If you've got sustainability in that, perfect. You're in great shape. But what people forget is that the largest producer by region, the largest producer of food in the world is East Asia. The second largest producer of food in the world by quantity is South Asia. The third is South America, and the fourth is North America. And yet, East Asia is the largest net importer of food in the world. And so, everything depends on what happens there. And Africa is suddenly moving into that category where it's becoming, for the first time, producing a lot more, but it's becoming a significant net importer. And so Canada's sitting there, not because we're a global giant in food production, we're a global giant in net export.
Yeah.
Because we don't eat it. And so we rely on some stability, and we've got to layer that in. I think we're getting there, not because we're doing necessarily the right things, but because the world is beginning to realize that they can't feed themselves.
Right. But in a world of mercantilism, we have economic disadvantage if we can't export as much as we want or as freely as we want. But if you're Korea and Japan, in that kind of world, you don't eat. That's a far, you have way less leverage.
So Shaun, I think what I saw for the first time in the last, I'd say 3 years, is a little bit of change with the people in power and then in the know in Japan when you say, what would give you security? And there's where the hard decisions come for Canada, because what could we provide that they would trust? And you begin to think about things like national treatment. Do you know what that is? I mean, that's essentially really the only country we have that with is the United States. And that is, if we have a crisis in Canada where we have a really bad crop and you have to prorate everything, you could offer them to say, I'll tell you what, you've bought on average this much from us for the last 5 years. Even though this is going to be a problem for Canada, we will give you a prorated amount that you've been buying. That's worth a lot. That's soft power, Shaun.
Right.
And I think we're not there yet, but we're beginning to think about it. But in order to make that work, we've got to graduate more of those Canadian companies that I talked about from the Continentals, and business. We've got to graduate them more into that. And it's beginning to happen on its own a little bit. I'm seeing a lot more, there's a lot more interest in marketing than there used to be in particularly in the rich part of Asia. And that's where we should spend our efforts.
Yeah.
So it's starting.
Okay. So we're kind of working our way backwards here. This all begins with research.
Yeah.
And one of the issues I think a lot of people in Canada are calling for is we need to be better at this. Even when we produce successful outputs, commercialization is also a challenge in Canada. But I want to talk about just research overall.
Yep.
And how, I guess, is there enough money going into research in Canada at the primary research level?
I think the obvious answer to that is never enough. Not when you've got the base that I've laid out for you, which is, look, this business is not going away anywhere. Yes, it's going to have ups and downs, but long-term future is solid. So why aren't we applying more research to it? What kind of research would you do? So RDAR has been exceptionally good at dealing with what I would call the kind of the crisis research issues around, like disease in canola and stuff like that. They've been spending large amounts of money dealing with, answers to that, and disease in animals, for example, significant amounts of that. But some of this money needs to be spent on thinking through the other piece of the puzzle, which I gave you, is that we don't just want to survive in this world, by being able to produce more on, better yields per acre or more pounds on an animal. We want to be able to make ourselves significantly different, because there's plenty of the world that'll pay for it, and so maybe it sounds very harsh, but I'm less interested in feeding the world than I am in making money from the people who can afford it. And so that tends to say, how do you make that product, indispensable to people? And that's going to be around, issues like health and taste and quality put together. And I think that's kind of the next generation of, at least some of the research has to go into that.
One of the challenges here is that it's easy to justify the research when we're in hindsight, right? It's like, there was this problem, or somebody had the foresight, and, after, 5, 10, 20 years of this, great research, look at the outcome that we got and the value that was created. That's easier because we focus on the wins.
Yeah.
But in the moment, if we're thinking about the next 30 years, at a time where governments are, we're hearing about austerity and cutbacks, man, it's a much harder thing for leadership in the country to say, doggone it, you know what, there's going to be some slippage here, and we're not going to have a whole bunch of wins, and there's going to be some projects that totally fail, and it's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. But there's going to be that one idea, that one thing that created a ton of value 20, 30 years from now. That's a much harder sell, Ted.
Okay. You're looking for another canola, basically.
Well, there's an example.
Yeah, another canola, or essentially a repeat of the pork thing. And I think that it's easier for that to happen when you've got the link between the farmer and the processor. I mean, if you're doing research, and this is, okay, I'm doing research because this is going to give you X number of pounds more on the ground, fine. But if you're doing the research that where what you're developing on the farm becomes the thing that makes it impossible to copy what you're going to do in your processing plant. So you link technology in the processing of the product with technology in the differentiation of the item. That's why canola worked. It wasn't just because we had a new type of rapeseed.
Right.
I recall, and I was very young at the time, starting out in Canada Packers. I recall that it was the Canada Packers laboratories that figured out how to refine the bloody product. And when you because canola is essentially a seed oil, it's not like soybean. Soybean's a meal, is a meal, thing. The key was, could we refine this product? and so the link between the refineries at the time and the product was absolutely key. And we don't look at it that way anymore. We kind of look at it like, individual projects, and I think you need to link together the processing and the growing to create a product. And then when you create that product and it's different, you know what, Shaun? Suddenly the scale issue it becomes your friend, not your enemy, because anybody outside of that, the people who are always largest scale, they're not going to want to embed something that requires going back into the crop and changing the crop. That's beyond them. They don't want to break scale.
Here's what you didn't say, Ted. You're talking about a commercial and the farmer. Okay. Yeah. And there's some intermediaries, of course, but what you didn't mention was government.
That's right.
And that tends to be when we have conversations about research funding and the amount of going into research, it's all in Canada, it is always centered around what is government doing in that area.
I'd rather, at the end of the day, government research is important. It was important for canola, for example. But at the same time, it's very important to stimulate research in Canadian companies that are going to link up with the farm. And let them pay for it. Those research. The reason why I was involved with Hormel was because Hormel did all of its research in Toronto. And Canada Packers was the research labs for Hormel. And 21 PhDs working on meat and and oils and animal feed, So what I'm trying to suggest is, as you build these larger Canadian entities, make sure your tax system works so that you can get more than just your investment in research. It'll be driven by the companies. They'll create products that are needed, and they'll link them to the agriculture supply chain, which becomes unique in a sense to that. A crazy example for you, which it didn't exactly occur with huge amount of research initially, was, we created. And again, your biggest problems is arguing sometimes with your own customers and then arguing with the farmers, because nobody wants to do anything that's going to cost money.
Yep.
So by accident in the 1970s, because we were so busy developing Japan, one of our key guys that was our partner in Japan was an expert on soybeans. And he was with me in Ontario at one point. We were down trying to develop some fish business, strangely enough, out of Homestead Foods in Lake Erie. And he said, "Oh, stop the car." I was driving him down there. He ran into the field. I didn't even know what the hell we were looking at. And he's starting to look at these things. And he says, "Let's forget about the fish. We got to buy these things." I said, "What are they?" "They're soybeans." And I said, what do you want? We literally went up to the farmer's door, knocked on the door, and he said, "You tell him we're buying those beans." I said, "We'd like to buy your soybeans." The guy looked at us like we were two lunatics.
Yeah, exactly. These two crazy people.
And he said, "I sell them to St. Clair Grain and Feed down the road. Go and see them." I went down there, knocked on the door of St. Clair Grain and Feed. "We'd like to buy this farmer's soybeans." "Oh, we can sell you soybeans from anywhere." And I said, No. His soybeans. He said, "Well, we can't separate them." And so I said, "Well, if we pay to separate them, will you do it?" Yes. He thought we were crazy. So we did. Guess what? Those were hardwood soybeans, which this guy had figured out, were bred from a Japanese variety in Ontario by the Harrow Research Station. They became the first exports of edible soybeans to Japan for tofu.
Right.
And so we started that business on this as a sideline, and that became to tofu, and then we had beans for miso, and then we had beans for natto. And guess what? The farm community began to do their own research, and a whole research industry jumped up over edible soybeans in Ontario. Well, they're now 20% of the soybeans in Ontario. My biggest enemy of that was my own company, who was the biggest crusher and refiner, and they owned Canadian Vegetable Oil Processing, said, "What are you doing? we want to crush those things." And I said, "No, we can give these guys," and we were producing premiums up to like 80, 90 cents a bushel, for soybeans if you could IP them. So, Shaun, I think a lot of the time we don't understand. Companies can do this work very well, but the incentive should come through both the tax system for sure, and a lot of regulatory issues that kind of squash the development. Your folks know that in spades. You can't even do things that would protect the industry, because the regulators have got all kinds of reasons that they don't want you doing stuff. So I would use the tax system and regulatory development more so than worrying about whether the government's going to throw more money in itself.
One of when we talk about research strategy, and I sometimes get get concerned when we talk about like national research strategy versus regional. Like I don't want to have that debate. But when we're thinking about where we need to go from a research perspective, are we doing too much spreading of the peanut butter? Are we not, do we need to be more focused? And, some people say like picking winners. It's hard to pick winners in without even knowing what the outcomes are, in many times. It's easy to do in hindsight. But what does that research strategy need to look like? And what do the KPIs need to be?
Okay. Boy, that's a big question. Well, first off, I think we absolutely have to do research, and government should be deeply involved in it when there is a really significant, threat, on the horizon. And we've got plenty of those coming in, mostly in disease, animal disease and crop disease. So if they're not doing research in that, then they're essentially putting our future in jeopardy significantly, and maybe even human health. So I don't think they get a buy on that one. I think they have to do it. But beyond that, I think it becomes really important that we create the situation where companies are going to want to invest in this research. For their own, we're not picking the winners. The companies are picking the winners, and the companies with their partners in the agricultural, the farm community. Together, you become a winner or a loser. Independently, each one, they're going to be a loser. If they work together, they can be a winner. And that's Shaun. That's probably the psychology that needs to really get in the industry. It's very difficult when everybody's so siloed in an industry to look beyond your immediate silo and your own immediate thing and saying, boy, I'll tell you, if I had a partnership, where I was growing something that was valuable to this processor, and this processor is going to stick with me because he's going to need this product. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Then that's where you begin to say, okay, how could we spend more money to make this better? I really like that formula a whole lot better than worrying about whether the government's going to give me enough money that all the researchers at various universities and government labs can kind of do what they want to do. So government's not picking the winners. The winners are coming forward because they've got the guts to invest in something that's different.
Yeah. So what does success in research look like then? Is it jobs created? Is it, how are we moving people in that pendulum of commercialization from local player to national player to, global food giant? What are the KPI? Okay.
All of the above. I think it's simply defined if you can get into a place where competition is less relevant, maybe irrelevant as it was for me for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Then, you can do what you want, but that should be the goal. Not, I think we measure the wrong things quite frequently. And I think the money is there to flow. It may be more than we think. I actually fear that if you opened the floodgates, you'd get plenty of money, but it wouldn't be coming from where you want it to come from.
Yeah. That's what I'm learning here is that it's not a money. It's not there is money.
Yeah.
It's not a money problem.
Shortage of guts and ideas.
The shortage of entrepreneurial spirit, or people willing to take those risks.
I think there's a bit of that. But again, that has become more so since we've lost the free trade side of the thing.
Okay.
That's become more so. So how do you get that back? Well, that's where the government comes into play, and you can do it in various ways. I strongly suggest you do it through tax incentives rather than just saying, here's a check, go and do what you want to do. Or trying to, I won't get into the politics of it, but some of these great programs, which are designed more for political, benefit than they are for actually, are we really going to see something out of it? I think it's a tough place for government to do the investing, but they've got to be there as part of this new, issue that we've got with mercantilism. If we just ignore it, we're dead. So we got to come up with smart ways of being able to put that money into action.
Yeah. Not easy solutions, Ted, but
no. No strategy. If you go into this thing as all tactics and no strategy, you're guaranteed to lose.
Yeah. Also, if you were looking for the easiest option, that might not be the best option either, right? That's the other part of it. Clearly not.
I mean, much will depend, Shaun, on whether we still have a functioning USMCA in a year or so from now. Yeah. And because it's easier to build on to success in the United States than it is to give up, lose that success and have to, regenerate it in Asia. We got to get there eventually. And this has certainly been a hell of a stimulus to do it. But if you're going to go into a market like Asia, you're never going to be the cheapest. You're never going to be the biggest. You got to be the best. And boy, there's enough people who will spend that money to do it. But if you can take something that's already successful in the U.S., that's why we have a trade surplus on processed foods with the U.S. We never did before.
Yeah.
Since 2014, we've had a trade surplus with the U.S. on processed food. And if you look at what that is, it's all stuff that's different.
Really appreciate the opportunity to spend that much time with Ted Bilyea. Awesome stuff. Really awesome. Really do appreciate it. And, I want to hear your feedback on what you heard today from Ted Bilyea. That was the first conversation, episode 1 in our Final Mile podcast we're doing with RDAR, and couldn't think of a better first guest. I want your thoughts because Ted covers a lot of ground there. We went into a lot of different areas, got his experience and his perspective, but now I want yours to follow up on it. Send me an email. shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also call or text the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147, and also appreciate today's show sponsor, Phospholutions. We heard from Craig Dick earlier. Now it's time to talk to your local retailer or contact Phospholutions directly. You can do that by going to Phospholutions.com and make sure you talk to your local retailer as well. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio. We'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this RealAg Radio podcast, brought to you by new Focus NXT herbicide from FMC. Focus NXT herbicide tackles the toughest weeds, including wild buckwheat, volunteer canola, wild oats, and sow thistle, with simplicity and confidence. See your local retailer today.